Hey guys, welcome back to the third episode in our Compclub Web Dev Workshop series of videos. So this week, we will be embarking on a journey into the world of CSS. So I hope you guys enjoyed the last video where we discussed our HTML elements and things like divs to make our navbar. And this week, we'll be learning about the styling of our website. So what really goes into making our website look nice and pretty. All right, so to get you guys a good idea of what CSS is all about, I'll pass over now to Kenneth and he'll talk you through the slides.
Yep. What is CSS? Well, CSS is short for cascading style sheets, and they are essentially what makes your website have style and look good. Let's take a look at what the website looks like without any CSS. So this is what your website should currently look like. With the nav bar, you can click them and they should highlight into whichever tab you are in. And our demonstration for this part here is to show you what this website looks like without any CSS. Let's go back to glitch, which is what we'll be using from now on, hopefully. If we rename the style.css to something like styles.css, the HTML no longer links to the CSS file anymore. As you can see, in our index.html, we href it to style.css, but we have the file called styles.css. And this should remove any CSS for our website. And yep, that's exactly what happened. So Eric, is this pleasing to the eyes?
I'm just gonna say I might need to wash my eyes out after looking at this website because definitely not the best. That's all I'm saying. So as you can see, without CSS, things just don't look very pleasant, I guess. And it really goes to show like how much CSS does for your website, right, Kenneth?
Yep. So normally when you want to create your own project using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you will need to manually link your CSS file to your HTML file. In our template in Glitch, we actually did that for you already with the style.css. So this will just be a quick slide. You can come back to it in the future if you want to make your own website. So in your index.html file, you want to add this line to the heading tag. Specifically, it's in the heading tag because how the website loads your HTML, it goes from top to bottom. So you want it to load the CSS before it actually loads any of your HTML elements, so it looks nice. Yeah, the code below is how you actually link it. Anything to add, Eric?
I guess to add to this, the link is already there for you in our template. So if you noticed from when we demonstrated the website without CSS, that is basically what Kenneth was talking about with the href, which is how the style sheet is connected to our HTML file. All right, so this is how the syntax for CSS works. So if you're curious, you can take a look at the style.css file within your project, and it should look a lot like this. So you'll see the selector. So the selector is basically there to select an element, and it could be either a HTML, or it could also be an ID or class of an element, which we kind of talked about before. And next to that, you'll see a curly bracket. So this is basically to tell the code this is where like the styling of this element starts. And then inside the curly bracket, or sometimes on the line under, as long as it's between the curly brackets, I guess, you'll have your property and your value. So there's lots of preset properties that you can change on your HTML elements. So in this case, the property here is color, and you can set them to different values. So in this case, our value is blue. And similarly, we do the same thing for our font size. So all in all, these two things will basically make our H1, which is the heading that we've selected, be blue in color and have a font size of 12 pixels.
So by now, I'm sure you're all wondering what class and ID syntax actually means in HTML. So first of all, we'll be covering, what's the point of these, I guess, class and ID? What's the point of them? Well, classes allow you to group HTML elements together and apply a certain styling to them. So if you want to apply to just a specific group of divs, you can just give them a class like my divs, and it will apply whatever style is underneath my divs to them. IDs, on the other hand, the IDs are conventionally only used for one HTML element. So if you only want to change the styling for one element in particular, you give it an ID and you just change it in CSS. So there's actually specific syntax for this. Below is a piece of code that shows you how you actually attach an ID to a div element in HTML. So ID is equal to quotation marks, my div ID. It can be whatever you want, but yeah. This is in your index.html file or whatever .html file. Now, for the CSS, if it's an ID, you actually refer to it as hashtag #mydivID. As Eric said before, this is the selector. And when you're selecting IDs, you need to make sure you have the hash in front of the ID name. So the compiler knows that it's a ID. So in this case, we made the color red for a HTML element with the ID #mydivID.
All right, so similar to an ID, we have a class for HTML elements as well. So if you notice in our example here, we kind of added on to the code from the last slide, and now we're adding a class myDivs to the first div, which we put the ID as myDivID, and also a new div that we created. So maybe we want to style these two divs to look the same, and that's why we've selected both of them. So now we can select these two divs using CSS. So keep in mind that the difference between selecting using an ID and selecting using a class is that for your class, you need to have a dot, or like, I guess a full stop, before the class name to specify that you're selecting a class. So class is always a dot or full stop, whereas like Kenneth mentioned earlier, the ID is always a hashtag. So now that we've kind of talked through each of the parts of this code, can you guys guess what the result would be? If you can't guess it, don't worry. Kenneth is here to save the day. He will do a nice, quick demonstration to show you what this all looks like.
Yep, just pause the video here and give yourself some time to think about it. And unpause when you're ready to move on. So I hope you guys have thought about this question a little bit. I'll demonstrate right now. So first of all, we want to create two divs, like so. And inside the divs, you want to add an ID. And honestly, you can call it whatever you want. Preferably, it's singular and not plural because IDs should only refer to one element. For your class names, however, you might want to make it a plural so you know that it's a class and it's just more obvious. So inside the div, let's call it this is the first div. And next one, we'll just call it second div. And we'll just add a class into the second div. And I'll create a third div just to make sure. Now for the CSS, remember what I said about ID selectors? Make sure to have a hash. Well, this is not an ID selector. This is a class selector. So my div ID. So now this first selector over here, this will refer to this div over here. What do we have there? We had color red. And for this one, we have border 1 pixel solid black. If it wasn't obvious enough, border 1 pixel solid black means there's a 1 pixel solid black border around the div. Now let's run the code and see what it looks like. As you can see, the first div, which refers to the first div on top here, has a color red. But did you notice both divs have a 1 pixel solid black border? And this demonstration didn't really work because I forgot this third div here, the third div. And the third div doesn't actually have any borders at all. So this is the power of classes because you can refer to multiple divs and give them whatever styling you want. And perhaps you don't want to give the third div a styling like border 1 pixel solid black. Anything to add, Eric?
No, I think you covered everything very well. So if you got this as what you thought would happen, you can give yourself a nice pat on the back. So you might be wondering, well, how do I know what properties to use for each of my objects? I mean, surely some of these properties work for some of them, but like not other elements, right? And you'd be precisely correct. So there are some common properties in CSS that apply to most elements. So things like border, which is basically the line around the outside of an object. Position, which is basically where the object is on your screen. Display, which is how it fits in with the other elements. So like, does it kind of overlap or does it show in a block? The color, which is, as the name suggests, the color of the element. There is also font. So there's two things, which are font size, how big or small your text is, and font family, which is basically what the font is. So, everyone's favorite font, Comic Sans. Then we also have width and height, pretty self-explanatory, and margin and padding. So margin is like the distance from the edges of the screen, and padding is like the distance of the element from other elements. So after listening to all that, you might be like, oh my god, information overload, my brain's about to explode. But don't worry, you don't have to visualize any of this because Kenneth's got you covered. He'll now show you some examples.
All right, as Eric said, there's a lot to process, but don't be intimidated. We'll go through each of the common properties of CSS, and you only get better as you practice. So don't expect to get all of this in one go. It certainly took me a lot more than just seeing it once to understand. So below we have just A, B, C, D, E, F, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 boxes for us to play with and see all the different properties of CSS. So the first thing we'll do is demonstrate to you padding. So the body selector in this case refers to every single element inside CSS. So normally in CSS you have like body. Not CSS, HTML. Normally in HTML, you have like body, inside body, you would have like some divs. And yeah, all the HTML you have is inside the body. So yeah, now back to the demonstration. We'll be demonstrating padding. So this will basically add 20 pixels between the div and the border. So if you click run, there we go. I think it would be a little bit more obvious if I add like a border to each of the elements. So we have a box here, box, border, 1 pixel solid, black. Oh, as you can see here, we've got to add the selector. That's quite important. There we go. We have a 1 pixel solid black border around all of the boxes here. And that's the difference between padding and margin. Say I add a padding of 5 pixels for each of these boxes. We now have 5 pixels between the letter and the edges of the boxes. But what happens if I add a margin of 5 pixels? What happens then? Well, as you guys can guess, we just have a 5 pixel space between each of the elements because it's outside the border. Cool. Another cool thing, you can add is change the font family of the body, which means every HTML element underneath the body will possess this font. So let me just copy something over. We'll just have this. We'll just use this font. Click run. Cool, looks better already. Yeah. So for some more specific demonstrations, we'll be moving on to positions next, which I think is probably the most complicated of them, but it's still not that bad. So what happens if we give a element the position relative? So relative by itself doesn't actually do anything, but when you add different positioning properties like left 20 pixels, which basically shifts the element 20 pixels to the right. Yeah, a little bit unintuitive, but it leaves a 20 pixel space on the left, so it technically shifts the element 20 pixels to the right. With position relative, it allows you to do different stuff like that. So if I click run, as you can see, this element is now shifted 20 pixels to the right. What happens if I put position absolute? Well, absolute has a little bit more interesting behavior. Let me just show you. There we go. So basically, it kind of takes the element out of the regular HTML flow and just positions it there. So when you're brute forcing, styling for CSS, position absolute is probably the way to go. You can position this however you like. You can go like top, 100 pixels. Basically, we'll insert 100 pixels on top, shifting it down 100 pixels. And as you can see, A is now there. Probably want a little bit more than that. Oh boy. Yep. As you can see, the A element is now below all the other boxes. Cool. So again, to recap, A, if I make it relative again, it's still going to shift. It's going to shift all the elements down now. Even though it's at the top, all the elements still got shifted down because A is meant to be in this position. So relative means 200 pixels relative to its old position, but the old position still retains. Again, to show you, absolute, these ones will shift back up because A's position no longer matters to these other divs. So the next common property we'll move on to is display. So there's a lot of different displays you can use, but we'll just be covering a couple. We'll be covering inline, block, and inline block. So let's just start. For inline, oh no, not again. So for inline, it basically makes it so that you can't actually set a height and width for this specific element, but it allows you to stack elements next to each other. So if I make the box F also inline, you guys can see that they kind of get put on the same line, hence inline. But what about inline block? Well, inline block, let's demonstrate. Still the same, but inline block allows you to put a top, actually allows you to put a height and width. So I can set the width of this to be 100 pixels, and there we go. Now it's 100 pixels wide. But if I had it as inline, this wouldn't actually work. I couldn't actually set the width. So yeah, inline block's a little bit more flexible. Next one is block elements. So block elements basically take up the whole space, takes up the whole line, so no elements can be to the left or right of it. So if I make a block display, you can see that F gets pushed down because it takes up the whole line, regardless of how big it is. And again, you can see that it respects height and width, unlike inline. And then now we've got the more complicated properties out of the way. We just go into some, more fun properties like background color. We can make the background color for box, whatever we want. Yes, you can redeclare properties like this again. It'll basically be from top to bottom. So I can override the border with like 3 pixel solid black. It will just read this property on the bottom. Very bad practice, but it is possible. Now, as you can see, everything's 3 pixel solid black. And yeah, you can also change the background color to, let's go light green. Cool. And yeah, this should be pretty much all the different common properties you'll come across. There's a lot of properties. We have a reference sheet there. And yeah, play around with these, get familiar with them.
All right, thanks, Kenneth, for that demonstration. I hope that helped all of you out in trying to, understand how the properties work. Don't worry too much if you didn't get all of it. It's very confusing, even for, both of us, after we've done it for, so much time. There's still things that, you realize and you learn, even as, you go and program new projects. So it's always about, constantly learning. So now that we've talked about CSS, it's time for our checkpoint. So we've provided some CSS classes for you. So don't worry, you don't have to do any actual CSS coding. All you need to do is mix and match the classes on your HTML pages. And, since we're so nice, we even have the options there for you. So it just makes your job a little bit easier. And, honestly, if you didn't have your options, I think it would be very hard to fill out as well. So yeah, I guess you can interpret it as us being nice or as us, making it actually doable.
So yeah, look inside the styles.css for what these like classes or what these options actually do. The name should be self-explanatory, but hopefully you're able to understand like what these properties and what these values actually represent. Again, your next checkpoint is in about.html, and just scroll down and you should see some options and they're commented out, and have fun and fill them out. So there was a lot to cover in this video, and if you're confused, that's fine. Just rewatch the video whenever you want, however many times it takes for you to get it. And most importantly, with CSS, the only way to get better is to try out new things. So, try changing some of the values for the properties we covered today, like border, margin, padding, and most importantly, play around with it, get comfortable, and yeah. Okay, so a quick recap of what we've covered in this video. We covered how to add classes to HTML elements, how to add IDs, and how to select them in CSS, and the common CSS properties. Eric will now go through what we'll cover in the next video.
Yeah, so for the next video, we'll be learning about more HTML elements. So kind of doing a 180 and going back to the HTML that we learned last week. But we'll add in some new things, and we'll even learn a bit about adding videos. So if you're interested in that, then definitely look forward to that. So for today, that has been all. Thanks guys for watching. This has been Eric.
And this is Kenneth.
And we'll see you guys next time.